We're back with Nation of Immigrants. Welcome to episode 10. It's been an exciting time as we get to talking about all of these different immigration issues. And today, as I checked the headlines, I saw that they're changing the chief of the U.S. Asylum Office. And I wanted to talk about what that might mean for our asylum process and actually take this as a springboard to start talking about asylum. Asylum is one of those forms of immigration relief that people can apply for, and that to me is very meaningful. And it should mean a lot to U.S. citizens because it goes to this whole idea that people are coming here for protection from persecution on the basis of race, nationality, political opinion, or, one of the principles that this nation was founded on, the freedom to exercise their religion. And so that's why asylum is so meaningful to me and I think to many others, and I think it will be meaningful to you too. But let's start with this discussion of why the chief of the U.S. Asylum Office has been reassigned and what that means, and just get started with our asylum conversation. So, welcome to Nation of Immigrants.
You're listening to Nation of Immigrants.
America is a nation of immigrants.
A podcast about U.S. immigration law with your host, Jacob Tingen.
Okay, so welcome again to Nation of Immigrants. Like I said, we're talking about people who have been reassigned because of, what's interesting is that some of the headlines will just tell you the chief of the U.S. Asylum Office has been reassigned. Other headlines will tell you why. And one of the reasons is that there was an internal email that this particular government employee sent out. It didn't seem particularly critical to me. And we have, I guess, the condemning language here, and I'll read it to you, and you can kind of see if you think it throws a little bit of shade, but it's not super critical. Basically, it's complimentary of the people who work in that agency. But here goes. In July and over the summer, there were some policies that were announced by the Trump administration in an attempt to limit who could apply for asylum. And what it focused on was people who came to our border but who traveled through Mexico shouldn't be able to qualify for asylum. Trump made a push where he issued an executive order. It ultimately got struck down and said that, we can't claim that, Mexico is a safe third country. And just because people have walked through that they can't apply for asylum here. That's not in accordance with our laws. And so, but consistent with this change, of course, that would require some shuffling and some adaptation by the Asylum Office. And so this chief of the U.S. Asylum Office said in an email, "We are once again being asked to adapt and to do so with very little time to train and prepare." That's an accurate statement. Perhaps maybe the administration thought where he said once again as critical, but it's a fair statement. And then he says, "If I didn't know that we have some of the most dedicated, most adaptable, and most talented public servants presently serving in the federal government, I would be concerned about being able to implement these changes on such short notice." But in effect, he's saying that he's not concerned because they have the best talented, most adaptable, most dedicated public servants. It seems to me that the email was more directed towards his staff and saying, hey, look, we've got some changes coming. I know it's going to be tough, but we can do it. But this email apparently was interpreted to be critical of the administration and critical of its policies. And so that seems to be the underlying reason as to why the Asylum Division Chief, John Lafferty, is being reassigned to the Potomac Service Center in Arlington, Virginia. So that's the headline, and that's the news, and that's what's happening. But I wanted to spend some time talking about asylum generally, and frankly, go back to what was happening over the summer. So again, I mentioned this in our episode about the myth of the immigration line, that some people just assume that there's a line that people can get into and come here legally, and there's not. And it seems that the Trump administration tried to make it seem that that's the way it would be when it comes to asylum. And there was an executive order that was issued that said, if you come across our border, not at a port of entry, and we find you inside the U.S., you're no longer eligible to apply for asylum. But if you come to a port of entry, then you would remain eligible for asylum. You'd have to make your case to an asylum officer at the port of entry. And then if you pass that, initial interview, you'd be allowed entry to the country is how it was working. So he issued this executive order, and there were caravans coming, and we can talk about caravans another day. It's not, central to what we're talking about today. We're talking about asylum generally. And so this caravan was coming, and they said, all right, well, if this is the rule, we're going to head to a port of entry. We're not just going to cross the border. We're going to head to a port of entry. We're going to do it right. The U.S. government is going to do right by us. We'll get our interview. We'll be allowed in, and we'll be given due process and the chance to ask for asylum. Upon arrival at the port of entry, they were told, well, this is a long line. It's going to be a while. You might have to wait in Mexico for several years while we figure out what to do here. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems unfair to say, hey, play by the rules. And then when you play by the rules, you close the door. But that's what the Trump administration attempted to do. Now, of course, the idea that people who cross the border not at a port of entry wouldn't be eligible for asylum is not correct. And that was struck down by the Ninth Circuit. So people have still been able to get across. And then, of course, there's been a big debate over why should Mexico keep U.S. asylum seekers in Mexico, and how should this process all kind of work out. Some of the responses by administration officials that were not emailed around were reported in another article. It's interesting. Some officials said this is flatly inconsistent with our treaty obligations, flies in the face of decades of case law, destined to be enjoined or struck down immediately. That turned out to be true. And then another DHS official said the move was a bad idea, that it would backfire. And here's what's interesting, and I kind of want to talk a bit about this. It says this administration continues to pervert the 1980 Refugee Act and its later amendments by passing regulations that burden its own employees with overly cumbersome, ill-conceived new standards. And so, and then it goes on to say, this rule does nothing to fix our broken immigration system, which is at its breaking point because of the administration's mismanagement. So one of the things that I've talked about when we talked about prosecutorial discretion and we talked about deferred action is that there were release valves for an overburdened system that the Obama administration was taking advantage of, that Trump is clamping down on because he viewed them as loopholes. And the end result is that it's actually making our immigration system less efficient. It's making our country less safe. And it's leading to results that I don't think Trump intended. And yet I guess the administration feels forced to say, well, this is the way it's got to be because this is the territory they've staked out, even though it's not leading to the results that they want. All right. Well, so let's talk about asylum. Why do people get to come into our border, come across our border and come into our country when they present for asylum? Like, what's actually happening? What's the process? What's in theory supposed to happen? So let's talk a little bit about the credible fear review process, because I think that's a good place to start. When an immigrant flees their country and comes to our country, if they don't have valid paperwork to enter our country, and let's assume they come up to a port of entry, prior to this policy by Trump where they have to wait outside in Mexico. But let's assume that they come to our country and they come up to a port of entry. If they don't have the proper paperwork, they can tell an immigration official, I'm afraid I can't go back. If I go back, they'll kill me. At that point, the border official or the government official that talks to them at the port of entry should pull this person aside and give them what's known as a credible fear review. It's basically an interview with an officer to determine if they might be able to prove in court later on a full asylum case. What it is not is it's not a hearing. The officer at the border isn't supposed to make a decision on their asylum claim. He's supposed to make sure that they're telling the truth. If they express fear, and that fear and the story that's told to support it is internally consistent and believable, and it seems like there could be a chance possibly that they might be able to prove their case in a court, in the immigration courts, then that person is allowed into the country. Frequently, when they come in through a port of entry, that person is given parole, which is a form of legal status, for a temporary period of time. And then at that point, if they file for asylum before that time period expires, then they don't accrue unlawful presence and they haven't broken any of our laws. So many of these people who express fear if they come to a port of entry have violated zero laws. It is not correct to call them illegal aliens because they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't broken any laws. And so, this is why it's important to use correct language. Words matter. Undocumented immigrant is actually accurate for a person who does that. If they come across the border without lawful status, again, in our industry, we prefer the term undocumented immigrant, but there's an argument that you could say, well, they crossed illegally. And so if you said illegal alien, I'm still going to disagree with you, but I get it. And so I think that that's an important distinction. Let's talk about people who cross without status and who don't come through a port of entry. So someone who crosses without any permission, they just come up to the border and just walk across or swim across or whatever they have to do to get here. So let's say they come across and then they're apprehended by immigration officials. By the way, many of these people don't even know where a port of entry is. They're just trying to get here. Many, many clients I know say, yeah, no, I came across and then I looked for ICE. Like, it's the desert. I needed help, right? And so they're not even trying to avoid immigration. They want the process. They want to apply for asylum because they're afraid. So, if you think that that's immoral and that they've broken some law and should be punished, I guess that's your opinion, but I disagree. I don't think that that's necessarily immoral. And then the same procedure is employed for these people. If they express a fear, they're taken aside, they're given an interview, and if we determine that that fear is credible, depending on the circumstances and how much room we have in our immigration detention centers, they may very well be released into our community. They aren't typically given parole. That's normally reserved for people who come across at a port of entry. And then some of them are detained until they get a hearing before an immigration judge and can ask for bond. And so what we see a lot of is that family units who come across are of course, let go without being detained very long, again, because the government isn't able to detain children, even though they're trying to change that policy via regulation. But frequently we'll see that women are essentially let go and men remain detained, whether or not there are children involved in the crossing. So a lot of times women and children are released into the country and men remain detained. Sometimes we'll see a family unit cross and they'll allow the mom and the kids to go and they'll keep dad detained. I don't know why they don't keep the family unit together. If they're going to release mom and kids, may as well release dad too. But they'll make dad ask for bond in court and try to have to figure out how to pay that and get through that, web. So that's what happens when people cross the border. It's this credible fear review process. Now, why a credible fear review? And this kind of goes to this whole catch and release thing. I never really liked that term because we're talking about human beings, not fish. This isn't catch and release. These are people's lives we're talking about. But essentially, yeah, they come across the border. They are apprehended by ICE. We catch them. And then if they pass the interview, we release them. And so one of the questions is, well, why isn't it a more stringent process? Well, here in our nation, we believe in due process, right? And so due process demands that they have, for example, access to counsel, that there's, in theory, an impartial judge, that they're able to present evidence. And we acknowledge that immigrants and refugees who come across another country, who've come a long way and show up at our borders, that they may not have evidence, that they may not, at the time they're crossing into our country, have everything they need to get a fair process in our court system to determine whether or not they should get asylum. And so we give them a fear interview to make sure that they're, not lying, and do our best to determine whether or not they've got a credible fear of returning to their country. And if they do, we give them due process. We give them this American ideal that our court systems are fair and they're going to be treated fairly in our country. that's a good thing. So that's kind of where I want to start our asylum debate. That is partly why the asylum division chief was reassigned, because, clearly many of the officials took issue with this idea that people who come across our border and express a fear shouldn't be eligible for asylum, and clearly they are. And so the Trump administration is kind of fighting this, and they see it as a loophole that people use to get across. When, if you hear these stories, you understand that there's no loophole. These people are absolutely fleeing for their lives. So as far as future asylum episodes and why people are fleeing here, I thought I'd spend some time talking about each country. So that's what we have to look forward to. I'm going to talk about the Northern Triangle, which is Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. I'm going to talk about why Mexico isn't considered a safe third country for many of these immigrants. I plan to talk about country conditions, access to health care and mental health. I'm going to talk about gangs and why they exist and why they have such a strong presence in Central America. And then I want to talk also about why there are reports in the news that immigrants are not showing up for their first court hearing. And, while that's true in some cases, in many ways, it is the government's fault. And we'll get into that. So asylum, opening this topic, opens up a whole can of worms. And it's an exciting topic for me. It's meaningful. It's powerful. Asylum stands for what America stands for. And it's unfortunate that we're battling asylum seekers. So that's it for Nation of Immigrants. I did want to let you know, again, the podcast is now officially listed in iTunes and in multiple other places. I've got a page up on my website about Nation of Immigrants. So if you go to jacobtingen.com, you can find us there. And then also we've set up a donation page. If you want to support Nation of Immigrants and the work that we're doing, you can do that. We're in the process of setting up a 501c3, but even now, donations that you give, we plan to put towards bills that immigrants would have to pay, so they're legal bills and those kinds of things. Anyway, thank you again for listening, and I hope to see you come back and watch and listen and comment moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Nation of Immigrants.
America is a nation of immigrants.
Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Watch the live stream on YouTube and Facebook, or visit jacobtingen.com to learn more.